The date is May 9th, 1941. The time, just past noon. The place, a desolate stretch of the North Atlantic, south of Iceland. Here the world is a monochrome canvas of gray. Gray sea, gray sky, a relentless wind-whipping spindrift from the crests of waves that seem to have no beginning and no end. The cold is a physical presence, a thing that seeps through wool and steel, biting at the bone. On the surface, convoy OB-318 plows eastward, a scattered flock of 38 merchant vessels, fat and slow, their hulls laden with the materiel of survival for a Britain standing alone. They are the lumbering lifeblood, and all around them the water holds its breath. Beneath the surface, in another world of compressed air and coiled tension, Kapitan Lieutenant Fritz Julius Lemp, commander of U-110, surveys his domain. He is an ace, a knight of the deep decorated by the Führer himself. His world is a 20-foot-wide tube of steel, a world of perpetual twilight lit by the dim glow of gauges and the red battle lights. The air is thick, a cocktail of diesel fumes, unwashed bodies, and the faint metallic tang of recycled oxygen. The only sound is the rhythmic hum of the electric motors and the gentle creak of the hull as it flexes under the immense pressure of the deep. For Lemp and his 47 men, this is the womb of warfare, their iron tomb, their predatory advantage. On the hydrophones, the distant rhythmic thumping of the convoy's screws is the sound of opportunity. It is the heartbeat of victory, but there is another sound, fainter, more consistent. A steady, untroubled thrumming. It is not the frantic beat of a nearby merchantman, but the disciplined, almost monotonous pulse of a warship's turbines, a destroyer. Miles away, yet its presence is a low hum in the bones of the U-boat, a constant, ambient reminder that they are not alone in these waters. Lemp dismisses it. One destroyer, even two, cannot protect a flock this large from the wolves that are coming. He has brought his U-boat to the perfect position. He is the invisible hand, ready to strike from the depths. This moment, suspended between the gray surface and the black abyss, is the culmination of a strategy meant to starve a nation into submission. It is the high water mark of a weapon that seems to all the world to be invincible. To understand the crushing pressure contained within U-110 on that May afternoon, one must understand the state of the world in the spring of 1941. France had fallen. The Luftwaffe was bombing London. The British Empire stood alone, an island fortress sustained by a lifeline of ships stretching thousands of miles across the most dangerous waters on Earth. This was the Battle of the Atlantic, and it was a battle of arithmetic. Winston Churchill would later write, "The only thing that ever really frightened me during the war was the U-boat peril. It was a war of tonnage. How many tons of food, fuel, and weapons could the Allies deliver versus how many tons of shipping could Germany send to the bottom?" In early 1941, the arithmetic was grimly in Germany's favor. The architect of this success was Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the U-boat fleet. He was a brilliant, ruthless strategist who had revived and perfected the Wolfpack tactic from the First World War. It was a brutally simple and effective concept. Instead of single U-boats hunting alone, they would spread out in long patrol lines across the convoy routes. Once a U-boat spotted a convoy, it would not attack. Instead, it would shadow the target, reporting its position, course, and speed back to headquarters. Dönitz, from his command center in France, would become the unseen choreographer of a ballet of death. He would gather the scattered U-boats, vectoring them in on the convoy from all directions. Only when the pack was assembled would they strike, typically at night, a coordinated, overwhelming assault designed to slash through the thin screen of escorts and savage the helpless merchantmen within. The linchpin of this entire system, the single element that allowed a commander in a bunker in Lorient to control a dozen submarines across 1 million square miles of ocean, was radio. Every day, every U-boat reported in. Every day Dönitz issued his orders. They were complex messages containing precise coordinates, intercept courses, and operational commands. To the British destroyers hunting them, these crackling bursts of Morse code were maddeningly indecipherable. They could hear the wolves gathering, they could sense the attack was coming, but they could not understand the language of the hunt. The secret to this security was a machine, not a weapon of steel and explosives, but a weapon of intellect and electricity. It was called Enigma. To its operators, it was a marvel of German engineering, a typewriter-like device with a series of rotating wheels, a plug board of cables, and a lamp board. By typing a message, an operator would see a series of letters light up, scrambling the original text into a seemingly random gibberish. With millions upon millions of possible combinations, reset with new settings every single day, the Germans believed Enigma was, for all practical purposes, unbreakable. It was the technological soul of the U-boat fleet, the ghost in their machine. It gave them an aura of clairvoyance, of omniscience. A U-boat commander like Lemp didn't just feel he was in a superior vessel, he felt he was part of a superior system, a network of unseen brothers, guided by an infallible, invisible hand. The Enigma machine was more than a tool, it was an article of faith. It was the ultimate expression of a regime that prized secrecy, centralized control, and the idea of a technological masterstroke, a superweapon that could grant them victory. The men who sailed the Allied destroyers experienced a different reality. They were not the hunters, they were the shepherds, and their flock was constantly under assault. Their world was one of exhaustion and anxiety. Days blurred into a ceaseless routine of watchstanding on pitching, spray-soaked decks. The enemy was rarely seen. He was a shadow, a periscope, a torpedo track in the water, a catastrophic explosion that would blossom in the night, turning a nearby freighter into a pillar of fire. Their primary weapon against this invisible foe was ASDIC, or as the Americans would call it, sonar. It sent a pulse of sound, a ping, into the depths, which would bounce off a submerged object and return as an echo. In theory, it was simple. In practice, it was a dark art. The ocean was a noisy place, full of thermal layers that could bend sound, schools of fish that could create false echoes, and the wreckage of sunken ships that would return a solid, ghost-like contact. An ASDIC operator sat for hours in a small, dark compartment, his headphones clamped tight, listening for the one distinct metallic echo that meant a U-boat. And even then, the hunt was a brutal game of cat and mouse. The destroyer would race towards the contact, its own propellers deafening the ASDIC at high speed. It would drop a pattern of depth charges, huge canisters of high explosive set to detonate at specific depths. The explosions would throw up massive plumes of water, and the shock waves would hammer the destroyer's own hull like a giant's fist. Then, silence. The ship would slow, listening again. Had they crushed the U-boat, or had its commander, with nerves of steel, slipped away in the chaos, silent and deep? More often than not, the U-boat was gone. For the British and their few overstretched escorts, the feeling was one of being perpetually on the defensive, reacting to a foe who always seemed to know where to be. And in the background of this desperate fight, there was always that sound. For the Allied sailors, it was the sound of their own ship, the thrum of their own turbines. But for the German submariners, it was the sound of something else. The constant, patient patrolling hum of an Allied destroyer was more than the sound of a ship. It was the sound of industry. It was the sound of the sprawling factories of Britain, and increasingly the colossal, untouchable factories of a neutral America, a sleeping giant that was already, through its Lend-Lease program, beginning to forge the tools of war. It was the sound of a system that could build ships faster than Dönitz could sink them. It was a monotonous, industrial rhythm, the sonic embodiment of a democracy's slow, grinding, but inexorable power. It was a sound that promised that for every U-boat that slipped its moorings in France, there would be destroyers waiting. Always more destroyers. It was the sound of a different kind of arithmetic. Aboard U-110, Fritz Julius Lemp believed he was on the winning side of that equation. He was a darling of the regime, a recipient of the Knight's Cross. He was famous for an incident at the very start of the war when he had sunk the passenger liner SS Athenia, mistakenly believing it to be an armed merchant cruiser. The German propaganda ministry had covered for him, ridiculously claiming Churchill had planted a bomb on the ship to try and drag America into the war. But within the Kriegsmarine, Lemp was known as an aggressive, instinctive commander. He had sunk nearly 30 ships. He trusted his gut, his crew, and his machine. The men in his boat shared that confidence. They were the elite of the German military, volunteers all. They endured the crushing claustrophobia, the foul air, the constant dampness, because they believed they were the decisive weapon. They expected this patrol to be like the others. They would find the convoy, they would communicate their position via their impregnable enigma, they would wait for the pack to gather, and they would wreak havoc. They envisioned torpedoes running hot and true, the satisfying crump of explosions, and another tonnage report that would make headlines back home. They expected to return to their base in Lorient as heroes, greeted with brass bands, fresh food, and the affections of French women. They expected victory. What they did not expect was the sheer chaotic violence of the next few hours. They did not expect the world of ordered technological hunting to devolve into a desperate, primal struggle for survival. They did not expect their faith in their commander and their machine to be, quite literally, blown apart. Lemp, having shadowed convoy OB-318, has found his moment. The convoy's escort is thin, led by the British destroyer HMS Bulldog, along with the destroyer HMS Broadway and the corvette HMS Obrietta. Lemp brings U-110 to periscope depth. The sea is choppy, making it difficult to hold a steady course. In his sights, he has two merchantmen, the Esmond and the Bangor Head. He gives the order, torpedoes away. The U-boat shudders slightly as the compressed air ejects the eels from their tubes. Lemp watches. He sees the tracks. Then the explosions. Two beautiful, satisfying blossoms of fire and smoke on the horizon. He has drawn blood. But in his focus on the attack, in his moment of predatory triumph, he makes a small, fatal error. He allows his periscope to remain exposed for just a few seconds too long. On the bridge of the Obrietta, a sharp-eyed lookout screams, "Periscope! Green 30!" The game has changed. The hunter is now the hunted. Captain Joe Baker Cresswell of the Bulldog orders the escorts to converge. The first depth charges from the Obrietta are a signal. They are not close, but they are a declaration of intent. Lemp orders an emergency dive. Alarm! Caution! The klaxon blares. Valves hiss. The boat angles sharply downwards, plunging into the cold, crushing safety of the deep, but there is no safety. The sonar pings begin, sharp, insistent, metallic taps against the hull. They are the sound of a blind man tapping his cane, feeling his way closer and closer. Inside the U-boat, the crew braces. The confidence of a few moments ago has evaporated, replaced by a cold, stomach-churning dread. Every man knows what is coming. The first pattern of depth charges from the Bulldog is terrifyingly accurate. They detonate in a string around and below the U-boat. The world inside U-110 ceases to exist in any recognizable form. The steel hull rings like a massive bell, the sound so deafening it feels like it's tearing the air apart. The boat is violently thrown, hurling men against machinery. Light bulbs shatter, plunging the interior into a flickering, emergency-lit nightmare. Cork insulation, dislodged by the concussion, rains down like black snow. A gauge explodes, spraying a crewman with scalding steam. Water begins to pour in from a dozen fractured pipes and strained seals. The depth gauges are wrecked. The electric motors are knocked out. The main ballast tanks are damaged. U-110 is falling out of control into the abyss. Lemp is screaming orders, but the boat is dying around him. She is plunging past her crushed depth, the pressure groaning and shrieking through the hull. They are going to be squeezed into nothingness. In a desperate gamble, Lemp orders all remaining compressed air to be blown into the ballast tanks. It is their last chance. Slowly, agonizingly, the descent stops. And then, the crippled submarine, its motors dead, its hull leaking, begins to rise. It is not a controlled ascent. It is the uncontrolled surge of a dying creature gasping for its last breath. U-110 breaches the surface with a convulsive lurch, breaking through the gray waves into the gray daylight. For the men on the bridge of the Bulldog, less than 500 yards away, it is a stunning sight. A German U-boat delivered from the depths right in front of them. Immediately, their guns open up, pounding the conning tower with shells. Inside the U-boat, there is only panic. The air is foul with the smell of chlorine gas, leaking from the shattered batteries. A death sentence if they stay below. Lemp knows the boat is lost. His only duty now is to his crew and to his secrets. He screams the order, "Abandon ship! Scuttle the boat!" Men scramble for the hatches, desperate to escape the toxic fumes and the sinking steel coffin. As they pour out of the conning tower, they are met with a hail of machine gun fire from the British warships. Lemp is among them, trying to organize his men in the water. But in the chaos, the panic, and the sheer shock of the moment, the scuttling is botched. The designated engineer fails to open the seacocks fully. The demolition charges, designed to destroy the boat and its secrets, are not set. U-110, peppered with shell holes and abandoned by its crew, stubbornly refuses to sink. Seeing the U-boat abandoned but afloat, Commander Baker Creswell of the Bulldog makes a split-second decision that will change the course of the war. He had intended to ram the U-boat, but now he sees a far greater prize. He orders his gunners to cease fire and calls for a boarding party. It is an audacious, incredibly risky move. The U-boat could sink at any moment, or it could be booby-trapped. A young sub-lieutenant, David Baum, is given the command. He and his small team row over to the listing silent U-boat in a small whaler. Climbing onto the casing, they are struck by the eerie quiet. The only sound is the lapping of waves against the hull and the distant hum of the Bulldog's engines. That sound, that steady industrial pulse, which had for so long been a distant threat, was now the sound of their imminent capture. It was the sound of a world turning upside down. Baum and his men drop through the conning tower hatch, pistols drawn, expecting a fight. They find only a ghost ship. The emergency lights are still flickering. The air is thick with the stench of chlorine. Water sloshes on the deck plates. And on a table in the radio room, sitting as if waiting for them, is the Enigma machine. Next to it, laid out in neat Germanic order, are the code books, the daily settings, the operational logs. Everything. It is an intelligence jackpot beyond their wildest dreams. The boarding party works with frantic energy. They are not cryptographers, they are sailors. They grab everything that looks important, forming a human chain to pass the priceless materials up to the deck and over to the whaler. The machine itself is heavy, bolted to the table. They fetch tools and manage to unfasten it. The U-boat is clearly settling lower in the water. Every creak of the hull sends a jolt of fear through them. At any moment, it could take its final plunge, taking them with it. Finally, with the machine, the books, and a trove of other documents safely in their boat, they abandon the submarine. The Bulldog takes the captured U-110 in tow, hoping to bring the entire vessel back to port, but the submarine is too grievously wounded. The next morning, it sinks, taking its final secrets to the bottom of the Atlantic. It doesn't matter. The real secret, its cryptographic soul, is now aboard a British destroyer wrapped in canvas and under armed guard. Fritz Julius Lemp is gone. Some reports say he was shot in the water by the British. Others claim that, upon realizing his U-boat and its Enigma had been captured, he committed suicide by swimming back towards the sinking sub, choosing to die with his ship rather than face the shame of his failure. Whatever the truth, the career of a U-boat ace had ended in a catastrophe of his own making. The myth of the invincible weapon system had been shattered by a few well-aimed depth charges and a single, panicked mistake. The capture of the Enigma materials from U-110 was a secret of a different kind. It was classified at the highest possible level. The boarding party was sworn to secrecy, the crew of the Bulldog told to forget what they had seen. The official report would state that U-110 was sunk, with no mention of a boarding or any recovery. The reason was simple. The Germans could never know. If they suspected, even for a moment, that their unbreakable code had been compromised, they would change the entire system, and the advantage would be lost. The captured machine and its books were rushed to a quiet country estate in the heart of England, known as Bletchley Park. Here, a strange collection of university dons, mathematicians, and chess grandmasters were engaged in a silent intellectual war against the German High Command. For months they had been struggling, working from brilliant theoretical reconstructions of the Enigma machine, but they were always one step behind. The daily changes in the rotor settings kept them locked out. The material from U-110 was the key. It was not just a machine, it was the entire instruction manual. It gave them the settings for the rotors, the plugboard connections, the entire cryptographic DNA for the German naval code for the coming weeks. For the first time, the code breakers at Bletchley could read Dönitz's mail. The transformation was immediate and profound. The ghostly, indecipherable messages that had haunted the Allied commanders were now clear text. The Allies could now know, in near real time, where the wolf packs were gathering. They could reroute their convoys around the U-boat patrol lines, and even more devastatingly, they could turn the hunters into the hunted. Destroyer escort groups, no longer tied to protecting a specific convoy, could now be sent to the exact coordinates where the U-boats were ordered to meet. The U-boat commanders, once so confident in their secrecy, were now sailing into perfectly laid traps. They would surface at a designated rendezvous point in the vast emptiness of the Atlantic, expecting to meet their comrades. Instead, they would be met by the guns and depth charges of Allied warships. The tonnage war, for a crucial period, turned decisively in the Allies' favor. The invisible weapon had been rendered visible. The German ideology of a technological quick fix, of a secret superweapon that would grant them victory, had been undone not by a bigger bomb or a faster ship, but by the quiet, patient work of intellectuals, enabled by the bravery of a few sailors and the colossal industrial might that stood behind them. That relentless, monotonous hum of the destroyer's engines, the sound that haunted the U-boat crews, was now the sound of doom. It was no longer just the sound of a distant patrol. It was the sound of an enemy that knew where you were, it knew where you were going, and it was coming for you. The symbol of American and British industrial abundance had become the symbol of their intellectual triumph. What, then, is the legacy of this single, frantic encounter in the gray expanse of the Atlantic? It is a story of contrasts, the contrast between the claustrophobic, secretive world of the U-boat and the open, wind-swept decks of a destroyer. The contrast between the German faith in a single, perfect machine and the Allied reliance on a vast, resilient system. The capture of U-110's Enigma did not end the war, nor did it end the U-boat threat. The Germans would later add a fourth rotor to their naval Enigma, plunging the codebreakers back into darkness for another agonizing period. The Battle of the Atlantic would rage for years more, a bloody, brutal slog costing thousands of ships and tens of thousands of lives. But the accident of May 9, 1941, was a turning point. It proved that the secret weapon was not, in fact, a weapon. It was information. And in a war between a closed, totalitarian society and an open democratic alliance, the side that could gather, process, and share information more effectively held an ultimate decisive advantage. The Enigma machine, a marvel of engineering, was a product of a system that believed in secrets. It was defeated by the collaborative power of thousands of minds, by the industrial might of nations, and by the courage of a boarding party that saw an opportunity and seized it. The story of U-110 is a reminder that history does not always turn on the grand, sweeping gesture or the deployment of an apocalyptic weapon. Sometimes it turns on a moment of panic, on a scuttling charge that is never set, on a young officer who makes a brave choice. And sometimes the sound that signals the end of a tyrant's dream is not the roar of a conquering army, but the steady, relentless, industrial hum of a distant destroyer patiently patrolling the horizon, the audible promise of a world that builds faster than another world can destroy. It is the sound of freedom holding the line.